General David H. Petraeus served over 37 years in the US military, culminating his career with 6 consecutive commands as a general officer, 5 of which were in combat, including command of the surge in Iraq, US Central Command, and NATO US forces in Afghanistan. Following his military service, and after confirmation by the Senate by a vote of 94-0, General Petraeus served as director of the CIA during a significant period of achievements in the global war on terror. David Petraeus is a partner in the global investment firm KKR. David is also a visiting fellow lecturer at Yale University, a speaker with the Washington Speakers Bureau, and co-author with Andrew Roberts of the forthcoming book, Conflict: The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine. Please like and subscribe to see more great speakers on the Silicon Curtain channel. And of course, it also helps other people to discover the amazing guests that we feature. Please also consider supporting our work by becoming a patron. Let's dive straight in. I'm very grateful to you for joining the channel, David. It's a huge privilege to speak to you. And let's dive into the first question, which is really about the coup. And I don't want to speculate, and maybe coup is the wrong word for it, but what can we know for certainty about the events that unfolded in Moscow over the last couple of weeks?
Well, I think there are some facts that are generally agreed. One has to be that the leader of the Wagner Group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, saw various developments that posed an existential threat to the Wagner Group forces in Ukraine and also to his finances. The Ministry of Defense was requiring all non-regular Russian forces, and with a specific focus on the Wagner Group, to sign contracts with the ministry by 1 July, which would have meant that most important element of control that Prigozhin had, which is that he was paying his soldiers of the Wagner Group rather than the Ministry of Defense, would be gone. And they presumably would no longer be under his direct command. And I think the intention of the ministry was reasonable. They are trying to make this grouping of forces that is not as coherent as certainly the forces I was privileged to command over the years in combat, to make it into a more coherent force. Right now they have Army forces, some Navy forces, some Air forces, they have Special Operations forces, and then they have these irregular elements, the Wagner Group, the Chechens, the various militias that are associated with the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics and so forth. And I think they're trying to get a grip on all of these and to eliminate these fiefdoms, which don't always respond to the ministry the way they would like. So number one, that I think is a fact. It was all publicly declared and known. And I think that concerned Prigozhin enormously. Second is that some of the contracts that he had with the ministry were no longer going to be funded. Some of these reportedly allowed him to pay his forces. And of course, he was paying his forces more than the ministry pays its soldiers, perhaps as much as 2 times more. And then it's believed that he also had some other contracts for what we might term life support and so forth for some of the Russian forces support. So he was facing again what he saw as a relatively existential threat, at least to his elements that were engaged in the war in Ukraine, and also to his finances that enabled him to fund and support his forces and perhaps some of the Russian elements. And he clearly went to get mad. He'd already been criticizing the Minister of Defense and the Chief of the General Staff for some time, but right before he launched this mutinous effort, he criticized the very reason, the rationale for the conduct of the war in Ukraine and also calls into question the way it was being waged. So now you're starting to be critical of Putin himself, but without mentioning him by name. And then he launches this incredibly impulsive, more than quixotic effort, presumably to take the Minister of Defense and Chief of the General Staff hostage and perhaps negotiate on these two issues that I've identified until he comes to his senses, loses his nerve, and realizes this is not going to turn out well, or halts his forces less than 2 hours drive from Moscow, and then ultimately turns them around and, of course, cuts his deal with the Belarusian dictator Lukashenko, which allows him to go to Belarus, perhaps have some of his forces go there, those that want to. Others will be given two other choices, either to sign the contract, that was, again, one of the reasons why he was so concerned, or to go home. So that, I think, those are reasonably agreed facts. He did go to Belarus, was in Minsk reportedly, but of course since then has been back in St. Petersburg, where reportedly he was given access to his money and funding in terms of cash and gold bars and so forth, and also some personal weapons that apparently were quite special to him. But no one knows precisely where he is right now. And the arrangements for his forces who are overseas, which are really quite important to Russian foreign policy, because they enable the Russians to take actions that Russia can essentially disavow, or at least used to be able to disavow before he became so high profile, in places like the Central African Republic, Mali, Libya, Syria, and other countries. It's not quite clear that there will be changes to that, although one of his top four leaders has apparently been replaced. But beyond that, we really don't know what the long-term effect will be on the Wagner Group activities overseas, whether they will make their way back into Ukraine under Wagner, or if those that sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense. And then, frankly, what will Putin continue to do, as he has, in the wake of all of this, sought to show that he is firmly in command, has control, is unchallenged, and so forth. And of course, he's been spreading money around, touching base with all of his myriad security services, in essentially ensuring that his personal security and position are solid.
Now, you've commanded, obviously, a lot of people. What impact does it have on morale to see that on the home front you have politicians disagreeing? And actually, this is a new level of chaos, isn't it? But you have essentially a set of sort of warlords who are fighting it out. And you're in the trenches. Literally, Russians are in the trenches, dying for the so-called sort of propagandistic narrative behind the war, and yet behind the scenes you see these kind of political machinations. That can't be good for morale, can it?
I don't think so. It will take time for it to seep in. We don't know how much access soldiers have to this kind of information. You'll recall that during this episode, the Russian Federation of State put distinct limits on social media. It shut down Prigozhin's channel, his media, and so forth. So I don't know that we can assume that the Russians have all the information that we have, those that are on the front lines. But over time, certainly, that will become known in the trenches, and it can't be helpful. Beyond that, of course, the Russian force in Ukraine will have lost the services of some 25,000 or so Wagner Group troops, who, we should remember, did achieve the only victory during the winter campaign that Russia launched, and that was taking Bakhmut. Yes, they destroyed it in so doing, and yes, they took horrific casualties. The estimates are as high as 20,000 Russian losses just to take this city that is not particularly of great geographic or logistical importance. but it became very, very significant. The Ukrainians saw it as an opportunity to allow the Russians to impale themselves on Ukrainian forces and defenses. And now, by the way, it appears that the Ukrainians may be able to retake it. It clearly is one of their focuses during the offensive that they have launched, the counteroffensive, which is grindingly achieving steady but slow gains. And I think recognizing that they cannot just launch right into the multiple defensive layers that the Russians have established, especially in the southern part, the southeastern part of the country, and Bakhmut is more in the east-southeast. But those areas where the counteroffensive is encountering these very substantial minefields, anti-tank and anti-personnel mines, overwatched by Russian soldiers who have indirect fires that they can use when the Ukrainians are trying to breach those minefields. That's very, very difficult. There are also very substantial obstacles. And again, the trench works are in depth. So this is very, very challenging for a Ukrainian force that doesn't have the kind of air power that we would put over such an operation. It has some limited capacity to go after the indirect fires that have been a big killer on this battlefield, typically using drones as forward observation platforms, and then linking to the Ukrainian Western-provided artillery and multiple launch rocket systems. But that's challenging, and the Russians have made some adjustments tactically to try to make the drones less effective by jamming them with electronic warfare, limiting their access to GPS signals and so forth. So the challenge here for a force that doesn't have the kind of massive breaching capability that say a Western force would bring to bear, a U.S. force really only would bring to bear with massive armored bulldozers and so forth, just literally plowing right through this. But you'd have to make sure that you suppress the Russian soldiers, the infantry, their tanks, and above all, their artillery. And the Ukrainians just don't quite have that capability, even with the new tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, other weapon systems, and so forth. So they're going to very painstakingly make their way through these. And while they're doing that, they're setting the conditions for their ultimate success by specifically targeting and attriting Russian logistical depots. You will have seen that they just hit a major ammunition and fuel depot in the south, and that's after several others have been hit. They go specifically after Russian headquarters. They go after their reserve force assembly areas, and they go after the Russian artillery pieces as well. And so they're going to pick away at all of this, again, attrit it over time. And even as they are often at night with their night vision goggles now provided by the West, working their way through the minefield, which is very hazardous, very challenging, ultimately will reach a point where they can bring the combined arms capabilities they now have for the first time to bear. And that will be tanks supported by infantry and infantry fighting vehicles with mortars and artillery, with air defense, with electronic warfare, with engineers to breach obstacles, with logistical support right up behind them, with good command and control, and also, most importantly, with follow-on forces stacked right up behind them, so that when the lead elements culminate, as soldiers will, as units will, after 72 to 96 hours, it's just inevitable. You can only go so far before physically you can't go farther, and especially if you're taking tough losses. Then you push the follow-on forces through, you maintain the momentum, you exploit the advantages that you've achieved. But I think it's going to be some time before we see this phase of the counteroffensive, even as the Ukrainians are grinding out gains each day in various locations, say 4 or 5 different locations where they seem to be focusing, including the flanks of Bakhmut, where they are grinding out a kilometer and a half, and so forth a day, before they get to this breakthrough point. And I think they will achieve that at some point, and they will certainly try to cut this line of communications that the Russians have established along the southeastern part of Ukraine and enable them to resupply their forces that are in the southeast and south from Russia proper, and also up through the Crimean Peninsula, north of the forces that are just, again, north of the free routes that go into Crimea.
And Russia, of course, has shown that it doesn't limit its activities to conventional warfare. Throughout this conflict, they are accused of multiple war crimes against civilian objects, targeting energy, targeting fuel, light, heat, food, all these things. But specifically, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen the terrorist action, I think we can be fairly certain it was the Russians now, in destroying the Kakhovka Dam and causing a vast environmental catastrophe. Do you think Russians will resort to further either scorched earth or terrorist tactics if they are demonstratively losing on the battlefield?
I think they will do it even if they're not demonstrably losing on the battlefield, although I think they will be demonstrably losing, and I think they will carry out such actions. But you'll be aware that there's huge concern about the possibility that they might stage some kind of incident at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power generation facility, which is the largest such facility in all of Europe, not just in Ukraine, with multiple reactors there. And that's very, very worrisome, because if you could create an area in which life can't be, I'm not so sure it'd be as bad as at Chernobyl. But again, we have seen this particular movie before, and there is grave concern that the Russians might do something like that. And again, the Russians keep rattling the nuclear saber. They're really reaching for anything that could possibly create concern among European countries in particular, to try to drive a wedge between those who are just solidly with Ukraine and those that have some reservation. I don't think they're going to be successful in doing that. Indeed, I don't think that Putin will be able to show that the Russians can outsuffer the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and the Americans. But right now, I think that is still his hope, and that is his strategy. So yes, we'll see more of these kinds of horrific actions. When I was in Ukraine about a month ago for 4 days, every single night we were there, they were hit by, at that point in time, the heaviest missile and drone attacks. And actually there were a number during the day as well, which was unique at that time. And these attacks, again, didn't seem to be particularly targeted at Ukrainian military facilities. They're just going after, again, as you know, the infrastructure. Again, they tried to turn out the lights and turn off the heat and shut off the water during this past winter. They did not succeed because of the resourcefulness and determination, the mechanical skills of the Ukrainian citizens. But that was certainly what they were seeking to do.
And when you were in Kiev, you must have got a sort of direct sense, not just of Ukrainian resilience, but also I believe you went to an archaeological dig where they're digging up the remains of ancient Rus. And of course, before there was Russia, there was Rus. And, to those who know Ukrainian history, there's something called cultural appropriation as well as territorial appropriation going on here. What impression did that make of you when you saw that?
Well, first, I think you just have to try to appreciate the incredible determination of Ukrainian citizens throughout the country, but I think especially in the capital. They refuse to allow the Russians to keep them from going about their daily existence, going to work, going to dinner, sitting out in the nice spring weather. All of this, they just will not give in. Yes, they'll likely go to an air raid shelter when the air raid sirens crank up. And of course, they have an application now for that on your cell phone. But they are, they're spitting in the face of adversity. This is if you will, similar to, I guess, London during the Blitz. It's not anywhere near as devastatingly destructive, but it has had certainly its moments. So that's number one. And among all of the activities ongoing, here they are doing an archaeological dig, which happens to be underneath the American University of Kyiv. And I was speaking at the university, and they said, "Gosh, we want to show you what's going on underneath this huge structure where the university is being established." And here you have an archaeological dig. So again, even in the middle of a war, they refuse to give in to the Russians and not continue with that dig. And by the way, the historical significance is very substantial because it seems to show that Kyiv came before other now Russian cities. So contrary to the grievance-filled revisionist history that Putin puts forward, Kyiv came first. And that is, again, not just symbolically, but substantively very significant in undermining one of his various reasons that he's asserted for pursuing this war, all of which are basically flawed and inaccurate, but nonetheless, ones that he has put forward. So it was just fascinating to see that. And then just to see again how the Ukrainians just continue to go about their daily activities and to see how capable they are, how resourceful they are, how skilled they are, and especially in engineering, mechanical, and IT fields. And to see all of that being used to help the state rather than necessarily private companies, because everyone is contributing to the state. And again, the results that they have achieved in these areas are very impressive.
I mean, that's absolutely fascinating. And another country that is reassessing its relationship with history, of course, is Germany. And we saw an incredibly fiery address a couple of weeks ago by Chancellor Scholz defending the supply of weapons to Ukraine and denouncing Putin in no uncertain terms. I mean, that is to be welcomed, of course, but has Germany and actually the rest of Europe really woken up to what a malignant entity Russia has become and what a threat it poses to Europe and the free world?
Well, I think it's difficult to aggregate. I think it's a bit inaccurate to say Europe in this case, because in this case, I think there are various regions of Europe. And of course, the closer you are to Russia, if you're in the Baltic states, which have a border with Russia, actually the other one has, I think, was Kaliningrad, or Poland, or the Eastern European countries, again, the closer you are to Russia, the more substantially you are supporting the Ukrainian cause. If you have the luxury of a bit more distance, then you have the luxury perhaps to be a little less passionate, although Germany has been very impressive really since the very beginning of this latest Russian invasion. You'll recall that within a week, in fact, it was on the weekend of the invasion that took place back in February of last year, the chancellor announced this, which has been described as the Zeitenwende, this really extraordinary moment, a pivotal moment, where he announced that Germany would get to 2% of GDP on defense. They hadn't even quite reached 1.5% of GDP on defense. They would spend an additional $110 billion equivalent for defense, and that they would provide for the first time lethal weapons to another country, first time in their post-World War II history. These are very significant. I think it's fair to say that the translation of this policy declaration into action has taken a bit of time, but it has gone forward. And as you noted, the chancellor very forcefully reasserted those views in recent weeks. And I think that's very important as we lead up to the Vilnius summit that will take place next week on the 11th of July. Germany is a crucial player, obviously, in Europe, far and away the biggest economy, the biggest country in terms of population and so forth. So its significance is enormous. And therefore, again, what he does and says, and what the Bundestag does, and what it authorizes and appropriates, really, really matters. So there are a lot of eyes on Germany to see, again, if these expenditures will translate into military readiness and improved capabilities and so forth. But certainly the policy is very substantial, significant, and heartening from my perspective.
And of course, Ukraine has changed. When we compare the state of the Ukrainian army in 2014 and the initial invasion, it was in no way ready. Have they now assimilated the techniques of combined arms at a really great enough scale to really make this counter-offensive effective? Even though it's not happening as fast enough as the media would like, you think they've assimilated enough? And of course, the missing component is air power, isn't it?
Well, that is one missing component. I'm sure there are probably other elements that are not present as fully as, say, we would want in the U.S. Were we to be conducting combined arms operations. They don't have really that substantial when it comes to expeditionary logistics, for example. That's a little bit of a limiting factor. And keep in mind, they're talking about a 600-mile front in southeast and southern Ukraine. That's 150 miles more than the distance from Kuwait to Baghdad. And of course, I was a two-star general and division commander during that fight. So I have some sense of the logistics of these activities. And we had complete air superiority, essentially. So again, there will be various elements, but they certainly have a tank component. In fact, they have a larger tank force now than when they started the war, whereas Russia's tank force has been cut in more than half, by more than half, and a lot of it, most modern tanks have been lost. They're literally bringing out of mothballs little T-54, T-55 tanks, which are almost World War II or early Cold War vintage. The Ukrainians have infantry fighting vehicles. They have heavy artillery. They have a variety of other arms and capabilities. Again, engineers, air defense is really fairly robust, especially short-range, shoulder-launched, anti-tank guided systems, command and control, and so forth. The question is, can they put it together? Because they never have really done this. They did it to a degree last year in the fall offensive in Kharkiv Oblast or province when they liberated that area. But they, again, culminated. That force couldn't continue much farther. They really had the Russians moving and on the run, but they couldn't press the attack because they didn't have sufficient follow-on forces, and that's why I stressed the importance of those earlier. We'll see. You can't actually train for this because there's no training areas in Europe that are large enough to deploy really more than a battalion task force. And we're talking about brigades, 9 additional armored brigades, each of which has about 3,500 to 4,000 troops, depending on how they're configured. Again, our Hohentel's training area in Germany, where they have trained, our biggest maneuver area in Germany, the other training areas, again, they're just not as vast as, say, the U.S. training centers in the Mojave Desert, where you can get an entire brigade deployed. The area is just not large enough. So you can do simulations, you can talk it through, you can rehearse it without all the troops, you can do all these training tasks, but you then have to actually do it. And, having experienced this personally, where we, again, during the fight to Baghdad, where we deployed an entire brigade of nearly 20,000 soldiers and over 250 helicopters, and all the attendant logistics for that. That's a massive undertaking. And so they're going to be doing some, they're going to be learning on the job. It's on the job training, it's discovery learning to a degree. What I am impressed by, though, is that the Ukrainians are a learning organization. And I saw this even before this latest invasion. I was there the last time prior to this recent trip. I was last there just before COVID, after President Zelensky was elected. And I made the effort to not only meet with the Minister of Defense and Chief of the General Staff and their version of the Pentagon, but then went out to the east, to Kharkiv, to the essentially the regional commander for all of the Donbass areas, then went down to a brigade in Donetsk or Luhansk, and then literally to the front line. And in that particular trip, I came away feeling that these forces have really been transformed from what I remember in the past, going back many years. Even though actually the first time I was in Ukraine was when it was still part of the USSR. I was with the Chief of Staff of the Army when he made the first trip of the U.S. Army Chief of Staff to the USSR since George C. Marshall went to Yalta. It turned out to be just a bit before the Soviet Union came apart, but we weren't aware of that at that time. And then I went several times subsequent to that while in uniform, and then more times after leaving government. So the transformation has been dramatic, and it has accelerated with all of the provision of arms, ammunition, and other materiel since the beginning of the war. Keep in mind that the U.S. alone now is at about $41 billion worth of arms, ammunition, and weapon systems and materiel. So this is quite extraordinary, and many other countries have also provided very significant amounts. The UK, I think, has been prominent in often being the one that first provides a particular capability, say, long anti-tank guided missiles or the anti-ship missiles, now most recently Storm Shadow, the first to commit to various other systems, tanks, the first prime minister to visit, on and on. And that has been very helpful, because what you've seen is the UK essentially walking point for the alliance, walking point for the US. And the US then watches, sees what the reaction is, and then, it plows in 10 times the number of anti-tank guided missiles or the other systems. But again, the UK role here is quite substantial, including the role that is on the ground in ways that the US is not necessarily on the ground.
So we're testing this escalation dynamic just to see what Putin will do.
And again, in every case, Putin's threat has turned out to be hollow. And I think they will continue to ring hollow, but he will also continue to issue them, as will his subordinate leaders, trying to steer the alliance into reducing or restricting or constraining what it provides to the Ukrainians.
Now, you've talked about the Ukrainians' ability to learn, adapt, and develop, and the tremendous progress you've seen. They've also shown a willingness to adopt very unconventional tactics. So this includes, I don't want to sort of give too much detail here, but the sort of insurgency on Russian territory. There clearly is a degree of Ukrainian involvement behind that. And this is an extraordinary tactic to undermine your opponent. Do you think they're going to need to actually escalate that alternative warfare in order to take back all their territories lost since 2014?
Well, the efforts you're referring to, again, which they have not necessarily acknowledged, but at least not officially. Generally, these are acknowledged on background, as the press term is, without identifying the individual. But clearly they are ongoing. They are not necessarily intended to help retake the ground directly or liberate Ukrainian soil directly. I think they're really more intended to show the Russians that if they continue this, there is a price on the Russian Federation homeland and also to force them to divert resources. The operations in Belgorod, for example, just to the east of Ukraine, clearly showed that the Russian defenses of their own territory, even right near the Ukrainian border, were inadequate. And it forced them to divert some forces that might have been used on the Ukrainian front lines to actually protect a province that is very near the Ukrainian border. And then also to bring home to the Russian people, while going after legitimate military targets, and we were assured of this when I was in Kyiv, to show the Russian people that, your territory is not off limits, given what it is you are doing to the Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. Although, again, they are targeting, reportedly, legitimate military targets in accordance with the law of land warfare. So I think that's really the intention. Various elements within the Ukrainian military and intelligence service have been identified with those and certain individuals. And I think that is an appropriate initiative and tactic and operational campaign, just as they're also, of course, carrying out essentially insurgency operations behind Russian lines on Ukrainian territory. And that's got to be very challenging for the Russians because nothing is secure. Even their columns behind the lines, even those beyond the reach of the longer range precision munitions that the U.S. and West have provided, even those are not safe because there are Ukrainian elements back there that are seeking to blow up their command and control vehicles and command posts and logistical sites and so forth. And that also forces a diversion of forces to secure those activities, diverting them from the front lines.
It also gives us a kind of premonition, doesn't it? A sort of sneak peek at the state of Russia, the brittleness of its economy, its regime, its power structure. Should we, in fact, be preparing for some kind of collapse or disintegration even of the Russian Federation? Is there enough thinking going on in Brussels, Washington, London about this scenario?
It's a bit hard to say because this is obviously not a subject that those in Washington, Brussels, and elsewhere discuss openly. But the fact is there is that kind of discussion going on. There are concerns. This is not something we should necessarily welcome. We've seen what happens when these large countries that are held together by strong central governments collapse, and the outcomes are not always all that positive. We've seen it with the Arab Spring as well. And so you have to be very measured, I think, about what your hopes and aspirations might be. Were, for example, Vladimir Putin to either step aside or be pushed aside. I guess even he should avoid open windows and umbrellas on sunny days. But it is something that clearly does have to be examined and explored, and for which there have to be various contingency plans to the extent that you have any capability to influence what might actually happen. And again, I think we have to be very, very cautious and frankly, in a sense, intellectually humble and policy-wise humble about what we might be able to influence given our experiences of, say, the last 20 or more years.
And of course, Russia is nuclear powered. I mean, that must be a very prominent feature in the concern and these discussions.
It's the largest nuclear power. It has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. Obviously, at a certain point, I don't know how much you need to ensure deterrence. But yes, and there has to be a concern that they could actually resort to the use of tactical nuclear weapons in some fashion. And there has been a lot of thinking about that. There have been very serious warnings about that, including, very helpfully, from President Xi of China and Prime Minister Modi of India, both of whom have repeatedly cautioned Putin not to consider such use.
Well, my last question is probably quite a difficult one. It's save the toughest one to last, and that is the question about the supply of arms. It seems that we've always been a little bit behind the Ukrainian request, a little bit behind the demand they've had. Have we dithered and strung out the supply of weapons since February 2022? And what are the implications of that sort of slowness, if you agree with that idea, on the loss of life amongst the Ukrainian army and, of course, the civilian population? And we could include in this, for instance, the supply of Patriot batteries to protect other cities apart from just Kiev.
Well, first of all, I think we do have to recognize that the U.S. supply of $41 billion worth of arms, ammunition, and other materials is just extraordinary. It's impossible even to really grasp how significant this is and how substantial 2 million rounds of heavy artillery is, just to give you one example. Keeping in mind that you can only put about 43 of those rounds in a standard 5-ton truck, just to give it some slight perspective. So first and foremost, I think the U.S. administration and Congress deserve enormous credit for what has been provided, and also the way in which the U.S. has kept the alliance together. It's prevented Russia from driving wedges between Europe and North America. It's prevented Russia from driving wedges between individual European countries. And it has kept the Western world on board for all of this. Yes, the Global South and some very prominent other countries have not joined in, and in some cases they've actually aided and abetted Russia in various ways. But the Western world writ large has done very impressively. Beyond that, it is fair, I think, to say that there has been overcaution about the provision of certain systems. Where the Ukrainians request a system, the answer is, well, no, then there's reconsideration, and over time, well, then it's maybe, and then eventually it's approved. And we've seen this repeatedly, most recently with the commitment of Western aircraft and the decision to provide F-16s, and I hope that at Vilnius we'll hear more concrete plans announced for the training and supply of those aircraft. There is a decision that is supposed to be announced now on improved conventional munitions cluster bombs, basically, that can be shot from artillery or rockets, that can be very, very useful to the Ukrainian forces as they're trying to use area systems against Russian forces that are in these defense in depth positions. And I think that will be announced and will provide the variant that has the lowest of the dud rates, down around something less than 1.5%. And again, this is Ukrainian territory. Let's let them decide what it is that they want to keep on their territory. They'll be the ones who have to live with it. Noting that, of course, the Russians have already been using this kind of system, one that has a much higher dud rate, and reportedly the Ukrainians may have been as well. The same is the case with the original provision of the multiple launch rocket system, and with the longer range munitions for that, it's extended the range from roughly 70 kilometers to 150 kilometers, and there's the further decision about the Army tactical missile system that would take it out to 300 kilometers. I hope we will make that decision as well. It could be very, very useful to hold that with the headquarters, air and naval bases, and logistical depots on the Crimean Peninsula that are currently beyond the reach of all but the storm shadow, which is in limited numbers. Well, yes, and again, there's many others of these. The hesitation on the U.S. tank, which was critical, and that decision enabled the Germans to make the decision to allow Leopard tanks, German Leopards, to be provided from other countries and Germany to Ukraine. So, what there have been implications. It means that the Ukrainians have not had capabilities quite as soon as they otherwise would have. In some cases, again, the reluctance had to do with concerns about potential Russian escalation or something along those lines. In other cases, with the Patriot, there's a real opportunity cost. We just don't have enough Patriot batteries in the U.S. inventory. So if you're putting Patriots there, that may mean that they have to come out of a U.S. base somewhere else in the world, where they are very important to that particular air and ballistic missile defense integrated system. So again, there's a variety of reasons for this. In some cases, I think the hesitation has been reasonable. In some other cases, I think it has been overly cautious, and generally has shown to be overly cautious over time, because the Russian response has not been significant.
It sounds overall that you're relatively positive, however, of a better outcome for Ukraine. I mean, we can't say they will definitely retake 100% of their territory, but certainly they've survived. And you see the outlook as being relatively optimistic. Despite all the losses, they'll retain their independence and regain.
I think very cautiously optimistic that at the very least they can change the dynamic on the battlefield that could, in the most ideal circumstance, convince Putin that this war is unsustainable, both on the Ukrainian battlefield and on the home front, where we continue to tighten sanctions and export controls together with allies and partners, and that there could be perhaps a negotiated resolution as a result of that, and that there would be incentives for Ukraine, a Marshall-like reconstruction plan, a security guarantee, a path to NATO membership, continued arms, ammunition, and material support, et cetera, et cetera. And then on the Russian side, to stop the horrific losses that they have been sustaining, which are now many, many, many times the 15,000 or so that they sustained in nearly 10 years in Afghanistan, and in this case, just less than a year and a half into this war. So again, that would be the ultimate hope. I don't necessarily think that's attainable with this summer fighting season, but it's not out of the question, especially if Russian forces ultimately begin to crumble, perhaps even collapse, because of a variety of factors, including the lack of a non-commissioned officer corps, the individual replacements rather than unit replacements that they have been employing, reduced morale as they consider what it is they're actually doing there, and see the Ukrainians all hate them in the areas that they occupy, and they didn't really want to be in uniform to begin with, and then the poor support and the relatively abusive command and control that is not the kind that fosters the ties and the relationships in the critical small unit level that really is the essence of the brotherhood of the close fight, if you will. In other words, that fierce desire not to let down your buddy on your left and right. And that goes all the way on up to the first line commanders. I think that we can see a possibility of the Russian morale eroding, their spirit eroding, keeping in mind Clausewitz's old adage that the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1, but it's not guaranteed. And we'll have to see how it plays out.
Well, thank you so much for speaking to us. I know the audience are going to be hugely appreciative of your insights. Thanks so much for your time, and good luck. We'll put a link in the description. You've got a forthcoming book as well. We'll put a link to that so people can watch out for the publication of that. and possibly speak about that in future when it does come out. It sounds like an incredibly interesting book you've been working on.
It's been great fun to work with the great British historian biographer Andrew Roberts, now Lord Roberts of Belgravia, of course. And our book, Conflict, The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine, has been very stimulating to write. And again, just a real joy to collaborate with him. I've known him very well over a number of years. I've done a lot of events with him publicly during those years that he has cranked out one extraordinary biography after another, most recently Churchill, George III, and so forth. So we're looking forward to the book tour together. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Well, it's been a great privilege speaking to you, David. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing your insights.
Good to be with you.